reading this passage, it seemed to me that this passage was kind of like the ghost of Christmas past, coming to say, what you have done affects what happens. And it's not what we expect. It's not what we expect. It's a reminder that what we do affects the future. Now, in passages like this, it's easy to focus on judgment, right? Because judgment has a lot of energy there. Right? Are you a goat? Are you a known frequenter with other goats? Are you a goat sympathizer? It's easy to go there. But one thing stands out in this scripture, and that is both the sheep and the goats, those on the right and those on the left, were surprised. What do you mean? What do you mean? They both asked the same question. What you talking about, Willis? It's the same thing. They didn't quite grasp it. They didn't know what was going on. Jesus is saying in this parable that none of the easy ways of seeing and serving Jesus work. None of the easy ways. Right? But my theology is sound, O Lord. The way I understand your word is true. I come to church on Sunday. I help some people I see during the week. I love my family. You know, Jesus doesn't mention any of that stuff. Any of that stuff. Our certainty betrays us. In our lives of faith, when we think we got it down, our certainty betrays us. And we're like both. Lord, what do you mean? What do you mean? And it's not just about us and our actions. You notice, it was to the nations. So it's not just, are we sheep or goats? It is our nation a sheep or a goat. There's a whole lot in play here, and it's all surprising. It's all surprising. There's a wealthy architect who designed his own home. It was a huge mansion on a great plot of land next to a lake. And he always gave the best parties. But there was one special party he gave every year that everyone wanted an invitation to. And the cream of the crop got invitations, and they came and they had a wonderful meal and a wonderful time. But this year, the architect decided to do something different. Instead of mailing invitations to everyone, he simply placed an advertisement in the personal column of the paper. It said, "Masquerade Party." And the type font was no bigger than any of the other ads around it. Those that said, "Help for unwed mothers," or "Blood donors needed." It all kind of blended. And underneath the heading for his party invitation, he explained that the guests should wear something to conceal their identity or they would not get in. It's a masquerade ball. As usual, the event would finish with a great meal. Only the best. Well, the ad concluded with the date and the time and the street address, but it didn't give his name or his phone number. But it wasn't a few hours after the paper came out that he started getting phone calls from those who have attended his other parties. There were mixed reviews. One of them said, "I'm going to be there as usual, but this is really a weird way to send out invitations for your party." Right? What if a whole bunch of people come? How are you going to feed them all? Worse yet, what if there are some of those people who come, people you wouldn't invite to your party? What are you going to do? But we'll be there. There are others who said, "Man, this is wonderful. This is a really avant-garde way of having a party. Very creative." We'll be there, he said. We'll be there. Well, when it came time for the party, cars were arriving, people were getting out, the guessing games began. Who is it under that mask? Who is it under that mask? They came, there was an orchestra in one of the rooms, The servants had hors d'oeuvres for everyone. The questioning began. Was that George Murdoch, president of the Computer Corporation, wearing that gorilla suit? And who was that behind the metal armor? Could it be James Brown, the gynecologist? The ballerina looks a lot like Cheryl Larch, the wife of Senator Banks' vice president, John Larch. And he might be the one in the football uniform. And who was that hobo over there? And that one, and that one. There were quite a few tramp types on hand. Perhaps the wealthy thought this was their opportunity to dress down like they never got to. Too bad so many of them had the same idea. There's a generous number of female casts off as well. Some were dressed as waitresses, some as cleaning women, some even looked like ladies of the night. Clever. Clever. That's what it was. Nobody had the slightest idea who anyone else was. And the host, where was he? Was he in costume? Was he there? Maybe he wanted to win the Best Costume Award. So their conversations all night began to see if they could figure out who was who. One of them said, but think about it. Maybe he's been wandering around and listening to us. And I said a couple of things I didn't really want him to hear. Well, finally some kind of hobo-looking man jumped up on a brick fence. He said, it's time. It's time for us to take off our masks. And people looked at him and thought, what's that looking guy doing? He's not in charge here. And as he took off his lifelike face mask, it was the host. And there were a few murmurs and then some cheers. And he had such a great costume, they thought maybe he did win after all. And so they began taking off their masks and laughing as they saw who was who. But they noticed that more than half of the people there didn't take off their masks. What was going on? Well, the host said, here's what happened. I usually give a great party and it's gotten boring. Same old conversation, so I decided to do something different. In the meantime, this last year, there was a tenement downtown that was scheduled to be torn down. But one of the city folks came to me and said, would you help us to build it up so it doesn't have to be torn down, because there were lots of folks who were close to being on the streets that if it got torn down would be on the streets. And so he said, I helped them at no cost. And while I did that, I got to know some of those people who were invisible. He said, you know, there's lots of invisible people. He said, so I invited them to come. I thought some of my friends would like to meet them. He said, in a few minutes we're going to eat. And if you'd like to learn more about some of them, talk to some of them, you're welcome to stay and have dinner with us. But if it's just too much for you, I understand. You don't have to stay. And so the homeless folks sat down first, and a few of his friends went and sat down, but a lot of them just sort of snuck out. And they missed a great meal. It's surprising. That's what Jesus is talking about. It's surprising. What will Jesus say to us? What will Jesus say to our nation? If this gospel passage is true, then I suspect we will all be surprised. In Uganda, 3 young men asked me for money. One of them came, there were 2 of them, and he had kind of a rough look on his face. And as I approached where he was, and he was going the opposite direction, he said, give me some money. And I looked at him and I just kept walking. Then there was another time when there were, let's see, was it 2? I think there were 3 young men. And they were all walking down the street, they were happy and they were joking with one another, and we were riding by in the van. And one of them looked into the van and said, "Hey, give us some money." And he was smiling. And I looked back and said, "No way." And he said, "What's that mean?" I said, "It means no." And we went on. And then I met another man in Jinja, and he said he was hungry, he wanted some food, and asked if I could help. And he had pretty nice clothes on. He didn't look like he was hungry, and I didn't have any money anyway at the time, and I said, "No, not today." So we come with today's scripture, right? So how we treat people is important. It's important. Now, as I thought about it, we don't have to give to everybody simply because they say, "Give me something." We don't. But we need to give to those who are poor. And as I thought about that, I thought, while I was in Uganda, I did give to a lot of folks in need. Mostly through organizations, but to a lot of people. And there were some people you just simply had to say, "No, I can't do that. That's not part of what I can do." But when we do and when we don't, we need to see why it is that we do and why it is that we don't. We always have to be alert, because Jesus always comes back and says something surprising. I hate it when he does that. As long as we are surprised, we struggle with God's kingdom. It's wonderful that we are friends of the great architect, but we are not the only friends. We're not the only friends. Jesus is embodied in the poor, the weak, the widow, the orphan. That's what Jesus is saying. And if you read the Old Testament, that's what comes back over and over and over again. It's that sense of justice that got me as I read through the Old Testament when I first became a Christian. And I bought into that. As long as we act on the basis of what we think is right or wrong, we grab onto that which benefits ourselves, we buy into party lines, then we will be surprised by what God thinks and says to us. And it won't be pretty. It won't be pretty. But the problem is, even our best attempts can fall short. Our motivation can be self-serving. A few years ago, I was driving down Pacific Avenue across from Jack in the Box, I think it was. Eric was in the car when he was a kid. I looked out and saw an older black man who was carrying a bag and walking very labored. I moved to the left lane and I told Eric that we were going to see if he needed a ride. I made a U-turn and I stopped to ask him if he wanted a ride. And I think the presence of Eric there made him feel a little safer. And so he said yes, he would like a ride, and he told us where he was going. So he was going to H&R Block to have his taxes done. It was only a short distance, but for him, in his labored walk, it would have been a long walk. When the man finally got out, we got back on our way, Eric said to me, "Why did you give that man a ride?" Excellent question. I told him when I saw him, I noticed that he walked like your grandfather who has Parkinson's. I said, "Wouldn't you want someone to stop and help him?" Now, because of his obvious slowness, he seemed both safe and in need. I also wanted to give Eric an example. I often wonder how Jesus saw that action of ours, Eric's and mine. A kind enough act, but he was like a loved one, right? And he seemed safe. Jesus doesn't say, help those who seem like a loved one or who are safe. Did I do a kind act for Jesus because I helped someone in need? Well, yes. Did I do it for me because he seems safe and I feel good about helping? Well, yes. I can understand clearly why both the sheep and the goat were so unsure, so surprised. Because this following Jesus stuff is not easy. It's not spelled out for you. We often think that it is the big things that count, right? When John Wesley and Calvin, Luther all get before God, God's going to say, man, you guys did a great job organizing communities of faith so that they could follow me. I'm not sure that's going to be part of the conversation at all. Mark Twain, in his autobiography, remembered his 7-year-old daughter one day crying her heart out over a broken toy and a picnic canceled because of rain. With some impatience, her mother told her not to cry over little things. She said, Mama, what is little things? Jesus lists a whole lot of little things, but says they're not so little. The architect says, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do to me. Dorothy Day was one of America's premier complainers. Good Catholic girl. She kept saying that things were not as they should be, and she was right. And she set her life to dealing with those. She said that it would be a far less cruel world if those who go to church cared for the poor half as much as they cared for their Bibles. Sad part is she's right. A student of Tolstoy was hauled into court for refusing military service. He defended himself by quoting from the Gospels. The judge impatiently said, but that's the kingdom of heaven, and it has not come yet. The student replied, sir, it may not have come for you, but it has come for me. Christ the King Sunday is here. Is Christ your King? This Christ of the poor, the weak, the outcast? When is the last time you spoke up for one of them? The kingdom, the community of God has come for you and me. Let us serve Jesus whenever and however we encounter him. Oh, and don't be surprised. He wears the disguise of the poor. Will we see? Will we serve? As we remember the wonderful